Now, one of the main questions when it comes to improvising is always, what scale am I supposed to use? Or what scales? Or what arpeggios? And being able to play on a chord progression that goes beyond 1, 4, and 5 is where things get tricky, because it's different from blues where you can just pick a pentatonic scale and wail. You need to start thinking about what each chord is doing inside the chord progression and then deal with it accordingly. But there is a way you can kind of shortcut this process. If you think about it in terms of this little hierarchy of, first you got your chord tones, then you've got scale steps that connect up the chord tones, and then you have chromatic notes that fill in the scale steps. That's a way that you can start to organize this so it doesn't seem so overwhelming. Now, this is a subject I'm going to go over in a lot more detail in my upcoming workshop on how to play the standard Indiana. And if you'd like to check that out and sign up for the workshop, go to the link below or the link on screen to find out more and register for the workshop. But in the meantime, in today's lesson, I just want to give you an overview of this process, because once you have the idea, you can apply it anywhere you want to. So I'm going to go over the first few bars of Indiana and just show you how to start getting around when you need to use more than one scale or more than one set of chord tones. Okay, so the idea is there's this hierarchy: chord tones, then scale tones, then chromatic tones. So what that means is, if you're on a C chord, then the chord tones are the notes of the C major triad. So the fifth, and the root, and the third, and then the fifth again. So if you've got your alternating thumb going, these are some of your choices. Now that doesn't sound that exotic. In fact, it kind of just sounds like you're playing a rag or a folk song. But if you can start to fill in the chord tones with scale steps, you can start with something like major pentatonic notes. So right above the fifth, you've got the sixth, and then here's the root, and then right above the root, you've got the second, and then there's the third, and there's the fifth. So now, we've got more scale-wise motion, and it doesn't just sound like arpeggio notes or chord notes. And then the thing that will fill in the scale steps is the chromatic notes, the half steps that can connect up notes that are a whole step apart. So a whole step is 2 frets, a half step or a chromatic step is 1 fret. So if you're trying to go from here to here to here, the fifth to the sixth to the root, you can fill that in. And from the second to the flat third to the third. Now, sometimes you can think of this as what's called a passing tone, a note that's connecting up 2 notes that are going in one direction, like from the second chromatically up to the third. But sometimes you can think of it as what people call a neighbor tone, which is a note next to the note you're playing, which means you're going to play the note like the third and then go a half step below that flat third and then back up to the third. So it's a passing tone. If it's taking you in one direction, it's a neighbor tone if you're kind of bouncing off of the chromatic note and coming back. Both of those things are really useful. So there's a neighbor tone. In this case, we're going from the root to the major 7 and then back up. So just using chord tones and then scale tones to fill in the chord tones, and then chromatic notes or neighbor tones, like either passing tones or neighbor tones, to fill in the scale steps, suddenly gives you all this vocabulary, and we're still just talking about a C chord. Now, the thing that makes something like a standard feel tricky is that there's more than just a C chord, right? This tune, Indiana, that I've been talking about, has all these chords just in the first 8 bars. From C to A7 to D7 and then a G7 and back to C and a C7. Now, in one way, that's not so bad, right? It's C and G, right? That's 1 and 5. But then you got these other chords. You have D7, which is the 2 chord, and it's a dominant, which doesn't really belong in the key. And there's an A7, which is also a dominant chord that doesn't belong in the key. So we've got C to A7, which is the 6 chord, D7, which is the 2 chord, then we get the 5 chord, and then we get the 1 chord. So that's why you can't just pick one scale and pour it over all the chords, because as soon as you just try to play a C scale over everything, you run into trouble on the very next chord, because you got an A7 chord here and the C from the C scale doesn't fit. And then you go to D and you've got this F sharp note that you got to have in the D chord, and that doesn't exist in the C scale. So all kinds of things that you got to be able to figure out. But if you look at each chord as a moment when you can think chord tones, scale steps, chromatic steps, then you've got this little window into what you need to do chord by chord. And here's how that works. We already talked about what to do on C. When we get to the A7 chord, let's think about it the same way. We got chord tones. Here's the root and the 3rd and the 5th of A. And if you can hold down an A chord shape, you can figure out what the chord tones are here, because what's a chord? It's made out of chord tones, right? So here's the root and then the 3rd and the 5th of A7, and we could include the flat 7 because it's an A7 chord, or we could put the 7th on top. And then, so now we've got our chord tones when we get to the A chord. Spelling out some chord tones. And then we could do the same thing when we get to the D chord. If we're going to play it up here or we're down here, if we look at it like this, we can see the chord tones pretty easily. Here's the 5th and the root and the 3rd, and we can go down and get the flat 7. And so from the C, if we just thought about chord tones, just moving around the chord tones, we can almost start to play a melody. And then when we get to G, here's the root, here's the 3rd, here's the 5th, here's the flat 7, and here's the root again. So and C7. So putting all that together, just playing chord tones, cheated, I put in one scale step for the G, but that's the next thing you have to do, is start to connect up the chord tones with scale steps. And if we do that, we can start to do it on all of those chords. And you can kind of just piece this together using your ear. Like if you're on an A chord, if you know an A sus chord, then you know where the 4 is. So here's the 3 and here's the 4, connecting up to the 5. And then there's the 6, it's right below the flat 7. So if you know the chord tones, you're kind of looking for the notes that connect the chord tones together and sound good. And same thing on the D. You can kind of just look around and listen and find stuff that pretty much is going to be the scale steps. And then when we're on C, we can go from chord to chord and start to play both the chord tones for each chord and the scale steps that connect those chord tones. And once you do that, you can start to make it sound pretty melodic. start threading your way through the chord progression, which is plenty to start thinking about when you're just getting going with this idea. But if you want to think about those chromatic notes a little bit, you can start by just looking for places where you want to connect up a chord tone from one chord with a chord tone on the next chord. So if we're on C, and so you can see that you're connecting, here's C with a neighbor tone below it to the A7, and then a neighbor tone below the major third of the A chord to get us to the D. And then here's passing tone chromatically from the root to the flat 7 of D, and then the 6 and the 5 of the D chord. And then here's a chromatic passing tone from this note of the D chord, the 5th of the D chord, up to the 3rd of the G. And then here's the 4th, the sharp 4 passing tone to the 5th of the G chord, the 6 and the flat 7, and then here's flat 3 to 3 on the C chord. So when you hear that kind of soloing, there actually is some logic and some reasoning behind it. It is not totally random. And by the time when you're listening to someone who's doing it fluently, it probably is fairly intuitive to them at that point, but they have quite possibly arrived at it by working out and knowing what the chord tones are, what the scale steps are, what the chromatic steps are. And that's something that you can do too to get a handle on how to start threading your way through chord progressions like this. And of course, I'll be going over all of this in much more detail in the workshop on July 19th. So to learn more about that and sign up, go to the link below or the link on screen. In the meantime, if you got a question or a comment about today's lesson, leave it for me down below. I would love to hear from you. And as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.